Okay, so this is building query for Sprint P. I think I accidentally introduced the previous call on Monday as building query, but this one that was using query, this is building query for August 14, 2020. And on the agenda today, a little bit fluid, but I think we heard from some would-be query users on Twitter about their interest in the roadmap for query supporting geospatial data sets and files. I think we can talk generically about that, or we can wait and see if that person joins or kind of push that towards the end. Otherwise, our typical format is to talk a little bit about what we did in Sprint P from a technical perspective. Anything else kind of big on the agenda?
I think that's a great start. It's a little light, but any questions from anybody are more than welcome for discussion. Cool. Yeah, I think we should talk about geospatial. Can I take the wand, Rico? Is that okay? The talking stick. There's no actual talking stick.
You're over here on my screen, so.
Okay, so try that and see how that goes. Cool. Yeah, and so we've had geospatial conversations from a number of folks, and we wanted to take some time to try and collect feedback around geospatial support. It's kind of unfortunate that Chris couldn't join us today. Chris is the person on our team who is the most sort of accustomed to geospatial stuff. And so I don't know how far we'll get into this conversation without Chris's input, but I think it's still worth sort of considering. And I think the way to sort of frame this conversation is around actually the types of file formats that query supports and whether we want to, and what stance we want to take in both the short and medium term for that conversation. And so I want to kick off with a little bit of a history and then open the floor up for discussion about file formats and just like present the sort of case as it is right now. So the current state of the art for query is there is very strong support for the CSV format. Pretty strong, but not as strong support for the JSON file format. And there are some lagging formats called like the Microsoft Excel format and CBOR, which is a binary format, which technically are still supported, but we don't really emphasize them in documentation because they're at best experimental. And so when I talk about support for file format, this is specifically the file format of the body of the data set. It's just the actual, how is the data actually stored and formatted? And when we talk about adding support for a format, we're saying, can we take data stored in a specific format, write that into a query version data set, and have query be able to operate on it natively? So all formats need to have sort of have like a baseline to the way that they work. They need to kind of be structured data. And the definition of a query body is sort of at least a list or a map of things. So it always needs to be some sort of collection. For a long time, we wanted to have really strong support across Excel, CSV, JSON, and CBOR. And we've over time kind of have shied away from that a little bit just because of this sort of maintenance overhead and the number of bugs that it can appear very quickly as you work across a number of formats. The other thing that we really sort of decision we made like sort of 6 months ago was to really emphasize the CSV format as you should use CSV, mainly because it it brings with it a tabular implied structure. Most people who are like diving into a new data set are kind of expecting a table, and a table is kind of the like common human way of understanding data that you aren't familiar with. This is like almost all of the world of SQL and like relational databases. It's built on the notion of a table. Obviously, we have the whole idea of graph databases as like another side conversation, which is why we include JSON. We think it's important to support some of those concepts, but at its core, query is most successful when you think about it as working with tabular structured data. That being said, we have long had a number of folks who are doing geospatial things with query and working with geospatial information. Geospatial data is really important to us for a number of reasons. The first of which is we spend a lot of time operating in the open data space, and the people who are doing the most interesting stuff with open data, really, there's a great community of folks that are not the most interesting stuff, but doing very interesting things are in the geospatial community. There are folks who are everything, just like putting stuff on a map kind of brings data to life. And because of that, you have a really rich ecosystem of folks building and working on things in geospatial, like in the geospatial space. I always trip up on saying that. But to that end, we've had a number of questions over the last, they've kind of heightened again in the last kind of 2 weeks. But just like these basic questions, like, do you support a geospatial file format? And like we've always said, well, yeah, we do GeoJSON, but we don't do the GeoJSON extension. And so like the question for the day is, we have this really great community of geospatial users. What we'd like to do is really understand what that seems interested in using Query, but needs more pluggability between the tools that they're used to using and what Query provides out of the box. We've heard feedback from a number of geospatial folks that just CSV file data kind of works. It sort of functions, but like isn't really like the ideal format for a geospatial project. And then so for this road mapping conversation, what we really want to understand is what is the best format. And obviously there are a number, but like, what's that nice sort of harmony of what formats would we need to support that kind of support the majority of use cases? Is there a sort of common consensus around a family of formats that are the best for working with geospatial data? And can we define a series of small incremental fixes, like just having query detect .geojson as a file extension and understand that that's a JSON file with a specific schema? Those kind of things are much easier to ship than shipping a whole new format. But I think what we'd like to ideally leave this conversation with is a better answer on where we're going to take geospatial support and balance that against a number of other sort of competing interests for the constrained bandwidth of query engineers. Some of the other projects that are really, like a number of other folks are really asking for encrypted and data and access control, which is like another massive project that sort of sits in direct, sort of like eats a lot of time around some of these things. And so if we're going to do geospatial support, we want to get it timetabled in a realistic way. And we would like to get it set up with a set of realistic, ship the most useful stuff as fast as possible. So with that, I'd love to like just get some feedback from query engineers about their opinions on supporting any other formats. And anybody who has worked with geospatial data in the past, I'd just love to hear what you worked with, how you worked with it, and just to start enumerating the possible formats and tools out there. Dustin?
Hi. I think cool, and you know, as someone who likes just, I don't know, data in kind of like the pure sense, like it's fun to like work with new data formats and stuff, but it's a question of the maintenance cost on it. Like, I think the reason why we didn't support JSON as a full first-class citizen, the way we do with CSV, is just that there were questions like, how do we display this in desktop and cloud? You know, like when you have multi-dimensional stuff, it gets harder. I'm not super familiar with the geo format in itself, but like if the work in like displaying it in the app is like really hard, it's going to have the exact same situation. So yeah, kind of mixed, and don't necessarily have enough information. So even not the most useful feedback, but that's kind of where I stand on it.
Totally. Anyone else? I know a lot of us aren't really geospatial sort of experts, so this conversation may kind of just end with questions more than answers, but anybody else done geospatial work?
I haven't done that. I think this is to exactly your point right now, which is I would just love to know from people who use it in their life, like the way that it would be used in query, or like the ideal way that it would be used, so that I can understand a little bit more about what the expectations would be.
Absolutely. I'm going to try and pull up a Twitter user while you talk, guys.
Sure. So like I got a few friends that work a lot with geospatial data, and from like what I know is they're very particular about like what they use, how they use it, and again, the tools that they use are very particular to their job. Considering query in that context, personally, I'd love for us to support a wide range of like data formats and stuff like that. On the other hand, like I don't want us to do a partial job, like and there's like things people use and consider as important file formats. I think it's more like up to us to pick like what are the like big ones and do those properly, because if we're going to do geospatial data, we do need to be able to diff it to, I don't know, understand like what changed, potentially visualize, at least in some simpler sense, to like give somebody a preview of that data set or things like that. So every file format will probably have its own like things that generally should come with it, and we should definitely build those in. And I think we should definitely go and make a list and see like, hey, these 3 are important, and long term we want to support these 3 extra because they give us the biggest breadth or capture the biggest use cases, or for the most people it's good enough. But I think it's really, really hard to support any given one. Like just looking at CSV, what we do, there's a tremendous amount of work just to support that properly, and then going to a whole new area that's like a mammoth effort that needs like a lot of engineering power and constant attention. Anyways, my 5 cents.
I'm picking up on a vibe, like no new formats vibe. Go ahead, Ezra.
It's not that. It's just that I would love to have them, but if I'm going to do it, I want to do it properly. Because a half-baked solution, I think in that case might be worse than no solution at all. At least people don't expect it to work at all, instead of like expecting it to work and then it doesn't.
Deep agree. Yeah, and so I'm trying to find the links to point to this, but this discussion started on, and the specific format sort of brought into question was the shape file format, which is a binary, if I understand it correctly, is a binary file format that is specific to geospatial data. I think it's the basis for GIS software. I'm talking a little bit on the edge of my knowledge here, so I'm not going to go much further, but that's the format that is sort of being brought into question. A number of folks saying, don't use GeoJSON in that thread, don't use well-known text in CSVs in that thread. And so like which is understandable, but to your point, I think that what is nice to hear here is this, that you just brought up, Admir, is like, let's not halfway do something. So I think what would have to happen before we would invest real time and energy in supporting geospatial as a first-class citizen wouldn't be planning out exactly how this would look and feel. And I think one of the, right down to the basics, as we said, we show a table on a query data set when you're showing CSV data. But if we supported GeoJSON properly, you should probably see a map in the same place you would see a table, right? With a preview of 100 values on that thing. If that's the case, then on our side, if we're running that on Query Cloud, we need a tile server. We need to be able to sort of we could start with like a simple version that just like uses Google Maps, and we pay their API license and call it a day, or OpenStreetMap and pay them, what is it, Mapbox? Maybe we just pay Mapbox to do this properly. But at the end of the day, we would need to sort of have a really clean and consistent mapping solution.
Yeah, that's the scary part, is like that's like a whole huge project into itself. And like doing anything less than that, it would be kind of like doing it halfway.
Totally agree. Totally agree. And so this feels like the kind of thing that we should really like do a very serious survey of like, okay, geospatial folks, what exactly what, if you use this, if we built this, would you use it? I mean, the answer might be yes, but they might not actually do it, which is totally fine. It's a survey. But the other questions need to be like, hey, what's the common size of data set that you're working with? Like, if they're the type of people who are encoding, 200 gigs of geospatial data like quickly and move quickly, maybe we work for them, but like that's going to sort of violate some of Query Cloud's max uploads, and then we're going to get in this weird situation. But if the average person is the average geospatial person is working with a lot of data sets that fit into smaller sizes, then interesting. And we can sort of like start to build up points in the column of why should we do this or we should do this. But I think we can also sort of break apart this conversation into some smaller things. And that's where I think the GeoJSON format is a really right candidate for better first-class support for geospatial data, where I can see us doing something right now that changes very little and just says, hey, if you type .geojson as your file extension and try and feed that as a body file, query should support that. It could support that as just a plain JSON file to start with. And then the next version of that is GeoJSON as a format that's separate than from JSON, which uses all of the same JSON parsers, but the schema is locked. It's determined by the file format. If I understand GeoJSON correctly, it's literally just a JSON document, but the thing that's different about it is its structure is very rigid and enforced by a sort of like external document. And we could work towards supporting putting GeoJSON data on a map instead of on a table, which would allow us to sort of pull in some of these features into Query Cloud in a way that doesn't require us sort of writing all kinds of plumbing stuff under the hood. It could be as simple as just a GeoJSON format checkmark.
I'm curious, when you were talking about laying it on top of a map, are you talking about on the Query Cloud website, or is this for some kind of tool? Okay. So just for the stuff that people have publicized, you can see the stuff on a map. Okay.
Yeah, just like that user experience of like what's in this data set, right? And this is where it's quite spectacular, right? When you see stuff on a map, it's like so much more. Oh, like my house is very far from this, and it's got this wonderful sort of like lifelike quality because it's actually on our planet. And I mean, just the amount of cool stuff you could do with geospatial data, like spatial joins are such an interesting thing that we're actually doing a lot of all the time. But yeah, it's a bigger lift because it requires understanding the world in a sort of first-class way.
Mm-hmm. I'm kind of
go ahead, please.
I'm kind of interested in OpenStreetMap, but I don't know very much about the underneath of it. So I've tried setting up a tile server myself before. I'm just kind of, my gears are spinning a little bit. I'm wondering if this could, like, down the line somehow make it easier to set up a tile server if like you have all the data in Query. But then I don't know if Query is very efficient for that because it's a ton of data to get the whole world map. So
yeah. I think the notion of a tile server is sort of out of scope for us. There are a number of projects that like do it really well, and they're definitely not us. But the challenge of moving around geospatial data sets is still very much in our wheelhouse. So I think that's where I'd put the dividing line. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think I'm going to invite anyone else's sort of final thoughts on this, but I sort of mark this conversation as like needs more input from people who actually have this problem before we can move forward.
Yeah, I think the key is just judging the scale of demand, I guess, in order to measure how useful it is and prioritize it amongst the other things that we're planning to do.
Absolutely. And I find it interesting that like we've had a number of almost everybody who's asked for geospatial, not almost everybody, many of the folks we've talked to who've asked for geospatial support in a sort of first class sense, we've said, cool, and do you also need sort of access control? And they've always said yes. And so you can see how access control may actually just be a higher priority, because when you put something on a map that includes personal information, and that's information that you need to lock down. And so it's important for many folks. But cool. Yeah, I think that kind of covers, we were going to have the geospatial conversation, but I think we're totally fine to sort of leave this where it is right now. Does anybody have any other sort of like pressing stuff they wanted to talk about today? I'm going to leave lots of space for everyone to think.
I have something that's not pressing. If there's time for that, just let me know.
Clearly. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just wondering about, I was just looking at the issues in the Query Python project, and I was thinking, it looks like 2 of them are already assigned. I was thinking of looking at the one where they wanted dataset.fields implemented. Is that any reason? I mean, is there anyone already on that one that I don't know of? And is there any reason it's a bad idea for me to explore? I don't want you guys to depend on my work. So since I'm just kind of, dipping my toes into this.
Totally. And no, that's always the expectation going into open source, where if you get it done, okay, cool. But it is not currently assigned. We try to be pretty active in assigning to someone if it is assigned. Dustin?
Okay.
That issue was also from a couple of years ago, and there was like a rewrite of the Python client recently. I'm not totally sure I understand what the issue is referring to. You're talking about on the query-python repo, right? Yeah. Yeah. I'd have to kind of dig. So I did the rewrite of this recently, and I left the issues there, but I'm not totally sure if they really apply in the same way. Like things kind of work differently now. But yeah.
I noticed that some of them are from 2018. I didn't realize this was one of those. I didn't look closely.
Oh, it's no problem. I mean, things kind of happened quickly, and there wasn't a lot of like visible conversation around what was happening.
Sure.
Yeah, let me get back to you on that.
No worries. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, but I mean, with that in mind, you've got interest in shipping code against the query Python client. So I think that we will take even proposed stuff that isn't defined as an issue right now on the query Python client. Are you working with Jupyter Notebooks, or do you normally?
Jupyter Notebooks, I mean, not regularly. I mean, I fired it up when you guys were showed off the demo the other day or the other week. But it's not something I do very often.
Gotcha, totally.
There's something there to be done. I may be happy.
And so that's the primary environment that we're targeting, which is sort of like this classic combination of pandas, Jupyter Notebooks frames, and Jupyter Notebooks as the like environment that we're trying to operate in, or get query Python to sort of operate the most cleanly in. And so the other reason I ask is just because I'm trying to understand how other people are using it. But generally, the query Python client, I think, needs just use, attention, and definition. And so we will take lots of, we're sort of like open for feedback on the projects. There's definitely room for improvement. It's very, very new. And so, yeah, we haven't done a great job of defining what we're going to do next with it, but we also are still sort of tire kicking on next phases. Dustin, is anything on the top of your head?
Yeah, I just did a reread of the issue because I think the first time I saw it, I kind of didn't understand what it was talking about and ignored it. But is this specifically talking about like a pandas feature that there's some specific way of handling schemas that's different than the way we do it? Because if that's the case, then that's something that's definitely out of my field of knowledge. I'm not a huge Jupyter user.
I think so. I think this is, yeah. Yeah, I think it's basically a return value of that will get you. It's basically engineering schema fields. I think it's an outdated issue and doesn't really apply. So I think we should not worry about it. But in this case, yeah, Dustin's been working on a lot of the implementation of this, but we've, as an example, Christos, who is on our team, also just submitted support for the SQL command. And that's like a great example of like just, cool, if you just hold up the query sort of like CLI tools and then hold up the Python client, there's lots that's sort of like not implemented between the two. And so like anything that's missing from there, there's some of them make a little less sense. Like we don't really want to do query peers connect inside of query Python. But would really love to do like, we have a robust query get inside of Python.
Yeah. Get is pretty thorough in that it returns objects for each component also that work like in their own special way. Some of the handling is a little early, but like you can get README as Markdown or as rendered HTML, for example.
Gotcha.
Yeah. I feel like the way we should think about the work on query Python is like, don't just implement them for their own sake, but kind of take a demand-driven approach, like whatever the pressure is coming from like the Jupyter Notebook side and like what we need in order to make this easier to work with should be the things that are added to it.
It's really on the like, can I easily go to query.cloud or use the search feature to just like get data sets, to see a list of data sets, grab that very easily, work with it, and sort of like have that all function inside of the Python client without having to like think too hard. And really, the biggest point of focus for us is like clear ergonomics of the API. Russ has been working a bunch on getting the actual query Python package documented on our website in a way that is sort of clear and easy to understand. So that's another massive part of this project as it sort of leaves the gates. Yeah, and so I think that's a much better encapsulation of it. thinking about commands for actual interaction with data sets more than anything else. That makes sense. I think there's a lot of little stuff. Like I think, like I'm thinking about the query save flag. Like we've got the save command. We've got lots of little bits in save that maybe aren't directly implemented in our save command on the Python side. Or yeah.
Okay, so maybe I'll look at query.save, see if there's something I can do there.
Yeah, and I think the reference guide is the actual CLI itself, right? Anything you can do with a flag on the CLI, let's make sure we can do that on the Python side.
Okay.
And make sure it's done.
What about the demand-driven approach though? Like if there's no.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, balancing those two thoughts at the same time. But yeah, so I think query save is a good example where it is something that we know that we would like folks to be able to use within the Python environment, but we don't want to. There may be certain flags that actually aren't implemented as arguments to the save command. That kind of stuff. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
We're really open to sort of like, if you want to just open an issue, like saying, hey, I've seen this, I'm thinking about working on this. Awesome. And like, if you open that issue, we'll make sure that you're not going to waste time or energy on something that isn't going to get accepted ultimately. Or if you're like, this is really small, I'm just going to open a pull request because it's really close to, I was in there, I saw the code and I think this change should happen. That's just as good a place to start the conversation. So there's no way that you should sort of wait for approval from any of us or anything to sort of move on what might be an improvement to the project. We will take any conversation starter there. Once we sort of get back to our not next sprint, but the sprint after that, we're really going to be focusing heavily on queries Python, like an upgrade to the Python client. And in that case, at that time, we'll actually start defining these issues properly and really put some meat on the conversation so that it's actually something that is open and easier to participate in, easier to pick up on. I feel like we have a pretty robust issue queue on like queries, core implementation. The desktop side is the sort of next in that order of like having a really nice issue queue of like stuff that needs to get fixed. We're just sort of getting our back into the Python project in a way that will allow us to have like a clean, like, hey, this needs fixing. This is unaddressed. This is stuff we'd like to see exist. Okay. And so all of that should be open.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Cool, thanks for asking. But with that, I think that kind of covers everything I wanted to cover today. Yeah, I sort of leave the floor open for any last questions, but otherwise we can break early.
Yeah, perfectly happy keeping it a punchy meeting. I think I'll take this video and when we post it, tag some of the people that seemed interested in the topic. And I think DK and Dustin know how to find each other on GitHub and or Discord, but DustMop is DustMop in I think most of those. Dustin is DustMop in most of those places. That's helpful. Cool. Yeah. Any last thoughts, issues, concerns, confusions, foibles? What's the list, Brendan?
It's great. It's a great list.
Oh, Dustin's coming back in the room. We can admit him and then say goodbye.
Cool. Welcome back, Dustin. The meeting's over. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everybody, and have a lovely week. Next meeting is in 9 days. Will be Monday, so using query call. Cool. Thank you so much.
See y'all.